In the first few years of the last century in the British Isles, there was only a few hundred wireless enthusiasts who talked amongst themselves almost entirely by Morse code, with spark transmitters and four-figure wavelengths. Note the words wireless, wavelengths and wireless enthusiasts. Well, the words radio, radio ham and frequencies were many years into the future at this point. They used three-letter call signs, often self-allocated. When peace broke out in 1918 and amateur wireless permits were available once again, the transmitting enthusiasts were faced with some startling changes. For one thing, the call sign structure as they had known it was no more. The new post-war call signs were to consist of numeral plus 2 letters, and I wanted to explore how the new call sign structure came into existence and to look particularly at one of the most famous of them, 2LO. It belonged to the London station of the British Broadcasting Company. The BBC became a corporation 5 years later, and LO came to be synonymous with London. It was one of the many self-evident call signs which the licensing authority of the time were in a habit of issuing. The licensing authority was the GPO, which then had a monopoly of electrical communications within the UK. A self-evident call sign was one which could be related phonologically to its holder's name, and 2LO was one of them. Now you may, depending on what you've heard in the past, be thinking, wasn't 2LO an amateur call sign? Well, it was at that time an amateur sounding one, but professionally used. The GPO's habit in the 1920s was to issue figure plus 2-letter call signs to amateurs and professionals alike. A call sign list of the period shows 2LO sandwiched between two wireless experimenters, 2LN in Lancashire and 2LP in South London. The precursor to 2LO was another amateur sounding call sign, 2MT. It belonged to a Marconi experimental station in Writtle in Essex, the MT standing for Marconi Telegraph. Its purpose was to give the growing body of wireless enthusiasts something to listen to. Its characterful main user was Captain P.P. Eckersley, an entertainment in himself, who was later to become chief engineer of the infant BBC. Neither 2MT or 2LO were alone in the mix of amateur and commercial call signs of the 1920s. Others included 2AA of the Radio Communications Company in Slough, 5AA held by the Leicester Mercury, and 2KH of the Ashley Wireless Telephone Company at Liverpool. Even the London and North Western Railway at Crewe made sure it got a call sign. It's more than likely that many of the amateur-type call signs issued to commercial companies were applied for in the hope that their holders would be allowed to undertake broadcasting. This had come about in the United States, where virtually anyone prepared to provide programs over the air could do so. At that time there were already hundreds of them in the US, but not so many in Britain. One organisation, the BBC, still a company like the other call sign holders, was charged with the duty to provide broadcast programmes for the population. Not many hours a week to start with, but gathering more airtime as the decade progressed. Its flagship was 2LO, the London station of the British Broadcasting Company, operating from its headquarters in Savoy Hill, a narrow street stretching from London's river uphill to the Strand. This new miracle of communication, as it was perceived at the time, earned hundreds of column inches in the newspapers of the period. At 2LO, a modest transmitter feeding an antenna on the roof of 2 Savoy Hill was superseded before long by a much more ambitious array on the roof of Selfridge's famous store in Oxford Street. It was good publicity for Selfridge's, as it was one of the sights of London to a wireless mad public. Its coverage was little more than the Greater London metropolitan area. To meet demand, the BBC set up an engineering project to provide what were to be called main stations in the UK's larger cities. Many of these were once again allocated self-evident call signs. Glasgow had 5SC for Scotland, Wales had 5WA covering Cardiff, but not much signal up to the valleys and beyond. Newcastle was 5NO, Manchester was 2ZY, and 5IT was for Birmingham. The service area, even for these main stations, was restricted. Soon, relay stations were established to fill in the gaps as far as the techniques of the period allowed, and many of the gaps remained quite extensive. The relays, a few hundred watts by contrast with the main stations with their kilowatt or two, didn't originate programs. They relayed what was sent to them via GPO landline from the main broadcast centres. They too were allocated self-evident call signs. 6FL was Sheffield, 6BM was Bournemouth, and 2EH was Edinburgh. When the BBC became a corporation in 1927, most of its call signs were reallocated to amateurs. Appropriately, Glasgow's 5SC went to a radio amateur in Dundee. Sheffield's 6FL went to a distinguished television designer of later years, and some of the ex-BBC call signs changed hands several times within the transmitting amateur fraternity, but not the most famous of them all, 2LO. To most British radio amateurs who were accustomed to talking with stations using numeral plus 3-letter call signs, the holders of numeral plus 2-letter call signs appeared to them as relics of another age. This wasn't always true, however. A select few of the 2-letter call signs that were carried on into the 80s and 90s belonged originally to the holders' grandfathers. Many examples occurred of the handing on of the call sign of beloved but deceased radio men to their local clubs. At Cambridge, G2XV was one. Another was G2NM, which belonged to the late radio experimenter Gerald Marcuse. His call sign continuity was maintained by the Chichester Radio Club. When G2LO, the G prefix later becoming mandatory, appeared on the bands almost simultaneously with G2MT, operators writing them into their logs must have thought that these were just relics. However, each was reactivated by a club. G2LO by the Aerial Radio Club, open to BBC employees, and G2MT by the Marconi Radio Society. Appropriately, G2LO was allocated to the Aerial Club's unit at Brookman's Park in Hertfordshire. Here, 55 years earlier, the first ever twin transmitter installation had been pioneered by the BBC. Its purpose was to make two alternative programmes available to listeners in order to offer a choice not available from the single transmitters in larger cities. A decade before 2LO was resuscitated, another memorable call sign made its debut in an amateur context. Daventry was the home of the BBC's original G5XX longwave transmitter of 1925, known nationwide as 5XX. G5XX went on to become another Aerial Club call sign. When a 70cm amateur repeater was established nearby, what better call sign to give it than GB3XX? Both G2LO and G2MT appeared for the first time in the 1984 RSGB callbook, quashing fears that they'd been pinched by pirates. These fears were finally dispelled when QSL cards bearing the hallowed call signs began to filter through to those operators who had contacted them.